I'm Stuart Johnson. I'm with the RAND Corporation and have been working for a number of years in the national security field, both in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and at NATO Headquarters. Right now, I'm working on developing responses to Mr. Putin's aggressiveness in the west and southwest of Russia. But the person who's going to speak first is our colleague John Merson, and he's going to give us a little overview of of his, not only the book he's recently written, but his opus and perspectives he's gotten in researching national security and foreign relations more generally. So I'm going to have him go first because he's going to lay out the broad foundations. After that, as soon as Bill Wise gets down the stairs, we'll follow with Bill Wise, who is going to give us some perspectives that he developed as in his career as advisor, not only in the White House, but also at the Pacific Command, with a focus on this very lively theater, the Western Pacific, East Asia area. I'll finish up. I will talk about Europe, Russia, and alternatives that we're developing to try to get ahead of the decision game and checkmate Mr. Putin and his aggressiveness and assertiveness towards Central and Eastern Europe in particular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by turning to our author and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Stu. There are some great seats down here in the front. I think you always get a better grade if you sit in the front row. And some extra seats over here, too, so don't stand. It's good, but it's not that good. I've been asked to speak about the Vietnam War, and I'm going to offer a worm's eye view, as befits a foot soldier. And since you know a worm doesn't have eyes, you know how limited my view was. It's not surprising that we're talking about the Vietnam War at our 50th reunion. It was a major presence in our lives during the 60s, whether you fought to stop it, fought to stay out of it, or fought in it. And it continues to be a presence in our lives. Last year, a woman returned to Vietnam to collect the remains of her pilot father. This year, one of the nominees for an Academy Award in Best Short Documentary was a film called Chow, Beyond the Lines, about a young man who was born with serious birth defects as a result of his parents' exposure to Agent Orange. And the film tells the story of how he becomes a very successful artist. It's an inspiring film. For historians, the war keeps on giving newly declassified materials, memoirs from people on all sides, and those originally written in Vietnamese are often being translated into English. Two of my favorite books are by the historian Christian Appy, Amherst class of '77, Patriots and American Reckoning. Patriots, I find especially valuable because it's an oral history, a collection of interviews with more than 100 people from all sides of the war and all sides of the anti-war movement. Let me illustrate just a few of the lessons that I learned as a foot soldier, and then a few of the questions that I find I'm left with today. One morning on a patrol through the village of Dialock, I saw a woman carrying 2 very heavy baskets of rice on a bamboo yoke stretched across her back. I could tell by the way this thick bamboo yoke was flexing up and down that she was carrying a heavy load, and I asked her if I could carry the rice. Toi kote mangao, and she, figuring that it was probably the best way to get rid of me, let me try carrying it. Well, I could pick up the rice, but then I couldn't move. And so I asked Brian Bukanowitz, the strongest person in our platoon, if he would try. Same result. So I gave her back her rice. She picked it up and walked rapidly down the road. And as I saw her walking, I realized when the bamboo yoke flexed upward, she took a step as the weight was taken off her shoulders. As the weight came back down, she had 1 foot on the ground. And I realized I was seeing thousands of years of Vietnamese culture captured in a single step that was easy for her and impossible for me. Now, we went to war at the height of the civil rights struggle. When Muhammad Ali refused induction into the military, I was a member of a 4-person team with 3 African Americans. Billy Tresvant from Detroit, Clayton Durant Turner from Chicago, and William Matthew Bethea from Philadelphia. Racial politics within our platoon were fraught. And everyone knew that African Americans accounted for more than twice the percentage of our platoon as their percentage of the draft age population. Racial politics were so fraught that we could not use the words white or black or Negro or Caucasian. Instead, we used the words splib and chuck. A splib was an African American, a chuck was a white person. Somehow these words diffused what would otherwise have been a much more sensitive situation. They did not offend. We got along with each other because we knew each other as individuals. And we knew each other as individuals because the only way we had to control our fears and make the time pass was to talk with each other. So we spent most of our time talking. On a listening post 100 yards out in front of our lines, dialogue might go something like this. Where are you from? Motor City, Windy City, Philly. You picked infantry? No. Billy wanted to get into the kitchen as a cook at Division Headquarters. Clayton just wanted to get out of the field, and William was our uncomplaining leader. You married? No. Why you here? I bet big on your mother in the 8th race, and she lost. It always came back to the mother. Our mothers were always with us. The rationale for the war was the one thing we never talked about. Clayton, Billy, and William knew the only thing they needed to know about the war. They were in it. And anything else was to them a dangerous distraction. Meanwhile, I was corresponding with Marshall Bloom, and our correspondence is in the special collections of the Frost Library. For Billy, Clayton, and William, the military was a chance to get out of the house, off the block, into a job that paid something, and maybe end up with some benefits that would help them with education, buying a house, or starting a business. When we heard reports of college students, like the class of '66 at Amherst, walking out on the Secretary of Defense, we could only wish to be there. We had an expression for it. We said, those students are skating. Anyone who wasn't with us was skating. When Clayton was finally transferred, or Billy was finally transferred to the kitchen at Division Headquarters, he was skating. It was a wonderful image, a frictionless puck floating across the ice. Another patrol started at the top of a steep hill overlooking the village of Duc Pho near My Lai in Quang Ngai province. And I should say that Quang Ngai province was one part of Vietnam that was never conquered, not by the Chinese, not by the French, not by the Americans. As we started down the hill, a sniper pinned us down behind boulders. And while we held the high ground, we thought, the reality was that the high ground held us. We couldn't get off it. So after several of our people were wounded, we called in an airstrike. And in a little while, a plane arrived and began flying over the sniper's hole and dropping bombs. Every time the plane flew over the sniper's hole, the sniper would pop up and fire his or her .22 caliber carbine. And after watching a few rounds of this, we began cheering for the sniper. You can have too much technology for your own good, but you can't have too much courage. I left the war in 1967, but it was a long time before the war left me. As a soldier, I often said to my platoon mates, someday we're all going to come back here. We know what a beautiful country this is and how generous these people are to us. Of course, my platoon mates said never, or words to that effect. We were all wrong. I thought it would be 5-10 years at the most, but it was 28 years before my wife and I traveled back to Vietnam. And my platoon mates were wrong too. Many of them have gone back to visit, and in some cases to live and work. Around the time I first returned to Vietnam in 1995, Ben Wilson, an engineer from North Carolina, was sent by his company to build a factory in the Da Nang area. It took him a year to get permission from the government, another 2 years to get the factory built, and as he was working on it, he learned a great deal about the neighborhood, and he saw a lot of children, particularly children affected by Agent Orange, based on the birth defects that he saw. And as he got ready to leave, having helped a number of these children while he was there, he began thinking about what was going to happen to them and what could he do about it. He teamed up with a social worker, Ms. Lung Thi Hong, and together they started a charity called Children of Vietnam, focused on the plight of children and families with birth defects caused by Agent Orange and sometimes other causes as well. Very often, so that the parents can work, the children need to be in orphanages during the day because both parents have to work. So the charity set up and supported orphanages that would take care of these children who would then return home on weekends. In the case of single-parent families, the charity would provide microloans, 40% forgiven, 60% repaid, and the single parents would use these to set up businesses that they could run from their home. Perhaps it was a store. And in this way, they could be at home and also earn a living. We currently raise about $800,000 a year, and each year we take a group of our donors and we travel around to our program sites, orphanages, schools, homes of these families where they have started businesses, and see what they're doing. And of course, we also stop and have some really delicious meals. This year, about half the group made the trip on bicycle, and the rest of us rode in vans so we could talk with our Vietnamese staff. At the end of the trip, officials from the city of Da Nang greeted us on the Dragon Bridge across the Han River in the center of Da Nang, and I had to give a speech in Vietnamese, which was really painful to listen to. The questions that remain with me. Why are young people drawn to the military and to war, as I was? How does the experience of combat affect them? How do soldiers recover from war? How do they make amends for the suffering and destruction that they've caused? And finally, how long is a war? When is it finally over? When the shooting stops? When the last person surrenders? When the last remains are identified? When the last wounds are healed? When the last chemical contamination is cleaned up? When the last child born with birth defects has found the support that he or she needs to live an adult life? When the last unexploded shells are removed from the ground so that farmers can once again use the land? By any measure of a war's end, even this war is the end of this war is a long way off. Thank you.
Thanks very much for those insights. It was terrific. What I'm going to do now is have Bill Wise, another classmate, give an overview of the Asia-Pacific region, a little bit on China. Tom Plate was not able to be here with us. I'll talk a bit about Europe, Russia, Putin, and then we'll open it up to questions. Steve Larrabee at the end will be the first one to, questions, responses, and so forth. Steve Larrabee at the end will be the first one to give a response. So, Bill Wise was, as I mentioned, has been on the Vice President's staff in the White House. He's served in very senior positions at our Pacific Command and keeps a good look on the Asia-Pacific region. Bill?
Is there an IT person in here?
Why don't I go ahead and can this be solved eventually?
No IT person, huh?
It's the equivalent of, is there a doctor in the house?
We are spared. I asked my research assistant to put together some PowerPoint slides to support what I was going to say. He's an Army officer, an Army major, and since the Army teaches PowerPoint before it even teaches weapons or tanks or whatever, I assumed that he would have this perfectly done. And as I read it, yesterday, last evening, I was somewhat appalled at the use of jargon. Imagine Army officers speaking in jargon. So I thought my principal job would be to put up the slides and translate the jargon into something all of us could understand. But on the other hand, some of that stuff isn't even translatable. I also, Tom Plate's absence surprised Stu and me. We actually thought until last night that he was going to be with us, or the night before last, I guess, that he was going to be with us. So I organized my remarks to deal with everything other than China. And let Tom do China, I do the peripheral issues. Since China is the issue, it strikes me as probably not a good decision for me to veer off onto the periphery. So I'm going to do what I think Tom might have said. I wish I had his remarks, but I don't. I'll do what I think he might have said and then follow it up with what I actually plan to say. In other words, as far as time's concerned, I need a little bit of break because I'm going to give 2 talks. First.
Yeah, don't be too modest about it. You've been China watching for a long time, Bill.
Well, there will be a 15-minute intermission between the 2. Okay, I intended to set the stage by reminding us all about the general national security objectives of the United States in Asia over the last 60 years. They're really 3. to prevent the emergence of a single state able to dominate the Eurasian landmass, to preserve open, rules-based trading system that engaged the United States with Asia, and to ensure that international norms, the way we define them, international norms about non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the resolution of disputes through peaceful processes, and the observance of fundamental human rights, that these international norms are recognized and observed by countries in the region, and that the instruments we use to promote these broad national security objectives are a network of bilateral security alliances and less formal security arrangements with countries in the region, forward deployed military forces in Japan, Korea, Guam, Philippines, Australia, and most importantly to the Navy afloat. International trade agreements, which have an important national security element to them, and fourth, diplomatic engagement to build political relationships and to begin the process of building regional institutions in Asia. This is actually what the pivot, what President Obama's pivot is about, is returning to these core U.S. national security objectives and the use or the application of these instruments to make them happen. Broadly speaking, we can call it the international system according to us. Now, China. China has a couple of interesting aspects to it that sometimes we overlook. China, yes, has burst onto the scene. The rise of China is the story in Asia. But in fact, China was always important by virtue of its geography. See this map. What you can tell from the map is that China is centrally located in Asia. It is the core of Asia. All of the rest of Asia surrounds it. In fact, China is bordered by 14 states, 14 borders, 4 of which belong to nuclear-armed states. It's not just geography, though. For China, it's the explosive economic growth of the last 2 decades. Absolutely extraordinary. That growth is changing Asia, and indeed is changing the globe. Parallel with this, in addition to this, is China's growing military power. China has always had a large army with domestic responsibilities. So when I say China's growing military power, I really mean strategic forces, rocket forces, air forces, and naval forces, the ability to project power far beyond China's shores. This is what is new. China's focused first on preparing for a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan is problem number 1. But the second, and no less important these days, is the preparation for regional contingencies, especially the East and South China Seas and the Korean Peninsula. And the political leadership of China has changed also. President Xi Jinping is more confident, more assertive, a new style of Chinese leader, something we have not seen. It's reflected in his willingness to tolerate a much higher level of tension in pursuing China's interests than his predecessors did. This is especially true when it comes to defending China's territorial claims in disputed areas. The leadership of China does not want, and frankly could hardly tolerate, a direct and explicit conflict with the United States. China needs a stable region. It needs a peaceful external environment in order to make the enormous economic transition that the country faces in the next few years. But China also has a history of provoking external conflict when internal conditions go into a decline. We've seen it on several occasions, beginning with Mao, but also with some of Mao's successors. And the regime's incitement of nationalist fervor, which is part and parcel of the Communist Party's program in China, This incitement of nationalist fervor may, in a time of tension, facilitate shall we call them bad decisions. China's growing nationalism is founded not only on the confidence of being a strong and powerful state, but also on an interesting perception of historic grievances, especially against the West and against Japan. So it is not simply having power that characterizes the regime in China today. It's power plus. It creates a sense among Chinese leaders and in the broader public that the international system has to show respect for China, has to understand that this new China is not the same China that the class of '66 knew when we arrived at Amherst, nor is it the China that our children knew when they were born. This is different. This is new. And the Chinese expect, to a certain degree, that the status quo powers in the international system will adapt themselves to China's interests. So the rise of China is the most important national security issue affecting the Pacific Rim and therefore the United States in Asia. How the US, how our country and our friends and our allies in the region respond to this extraordinary process of a rising China, how the Chinese perceive our response, how they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, how that all works out is probably the central security issue for the first part of the 21st century. But other things are going on, and now to my remarks. In parallel with the rise of China, though less dramatic, is the somewhat reluctant rise of India. And coincident with both is the expansion of economic activity and the spread of new wealth among Asian states. It isn't only China that's changing. It isn't only China that's rising. This latter development, the historic economic success of Asian states, affects populations there in diverse and, I must say, paradoxical ways. In some cases, internally, stimulating a nationalist pride in what has been achieved, while at the same time creating tension over the allocation of power and newly available resources. And in external affairs, this new wealth and sense of confidence that is found in Asia has the effect of affirming the value of regional stability and trade. After all, it is trade that got us where we are, in their view. But at the same time, as neighbors become more powerful, fears and rivalries increase sort of in parallel. Now this is a paradoxical development, but it is one that is easy to see if you watch Asian affairs closely. So anyway, Asia is clearly, Stu, the most important part of the world.
I cancel my talk.
At least, arguably, it's the most dynamic. It is where change is occurring at a rapid pace and in a visible manner. And certainly, when these things occur, real national security threats can arise. I thought I would talk about three major national security issues and how they relate to or do not relate to China. The three are nuclear proliferation, and when you're talking nuclear proliferation, you're talking North Korea. Second, and this is where we get a little bit into the land of jargon, the potential for interstate conflict with regional implications. Or to think of it a better way, nuclear proliferation and North Korea, that's a big bang. Interstate conflict like the South China Sea, that's a small bang. The third area is kind of a pop, and that is what else could possibly go wrong? Or to put it in the jargon of international relations, state collapse or the crisis with geopolitical importance. And there I'm thinking of things like the failure of national governments, everything goes south, environmental catastrophe, military coups, internal conflicts, large-scale terrorist attacks. We have them all. It's one-stop shopping in Asia. So, nuclear proliferation. And I really regret I don't have the stick for this. If you can put up Kim Jong-un, that makes my trip worthwhile.
Give me a second. Okay. If you want to talk amongst yourselves.
I'll just say, thank you very much.
Bill, go ahead and give my talk while we're waiting.
All right. My use of technology is legendary in my school, and I'm going to be able to milk this for a long time. Thank you. Thank you very much. Kim Jong-un, third ruler in the Kim dynasty. Like his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, and his father, Kim Jong-il, young Kim Jong-un's primary, perhaps only national security objective is regime survival. He believes, possibly not without reason, but he believes that the US goal in Korea is regime change. His predecessors, his father and grandfather, learned lessons from previous conflicts, especially the First and Second Iraq Wars, and to a certain extent the Balkans. What they learned is the United States will attack almost anyone for almost any reason, but won't go near someone or a country with nuclear weapons. That is the lesson that they took. So the Kims armed up and have built a small nuclear arsenal and are developing the means to deliver their weapons far from their own country. We have tried many alternatives in dealing with North Korea. Incidentally, how do I actually move this? It's okay, I don't need to do it yet, but I'm just curious. Oh, okay. This, which? So, okay. And that's backwards. Okay, thank you. So we tried many alternatives in dealing with North Korea. We've offered threats and we've offered incentives to denuclearize, as has South Korea. Nothing has worked. Nothing has worked. The Obama administration, feeling this, pursued a policy of what is called strategic patience or strategic neglect, either way, not doing what Kim Jong-un wanted, which is to negotiate with North Korea, recognize it as a nuclear state, negotiate it with North Korea on a parallel track with other nuclear states. One thing that the administration has tried to do, however, that's different, that continues previous administrations, is to lean heavily on the Chinese, the Kim's only friend in the world, to lean heavily on the Chinese to change North Korea's behavior. Chinese leaders, however, hold a very different view of North Korea. While they oppose the introduction of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, at the same time they fear even more the collapse of North Korea. Chinese leaders think that a collapse of North Korea, which would result from them withdrawing support or using leverage on them, a collapse of North Korea would have two disastrous results. First, it would unleash a flow of Korean refugees and migrants into the politically sensitive area of northeast China. And second, it would create a unified Korea under the control of of South Korea, a U.S. treaty ally and a country in which the U.S. has military forces. Okay, just building on the legend. Xi Jinping may not like Kim Jong-un, and it is widely reported that he, shall we say, dislikes him. But the most likely alternative to the Kim dynasty is just not acceptable to Beijing. That's why the Chinese support denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula rhetorically and argue with the North Koreans about the importance of negotiating away their nuclear weapons, while at the same time not using their economic leverage to make this actually happen. So, North Korea is actively building its nuclear weapons inventory. This is the main nuclear weapons test site. It's a pretty sophisticated place. They have a number of weapons, the number of which I'm not certain of. The low end probably is 4 to 7. The high end maybe double that. And more importantly, for us, they are simultaneously developing intercontinental ballistic missiles to deliver those nuclear weapons to distant shores, for example, ours. So nuclear proliferation has been, and will continue to be a major problem of security beyond just the rise of China. A second place of importance is the South China Sea. Overlapping territorial claims in the South China Sea, as well as the East China Sea to the north of this, between China and Japan, pose a serious threat, a real threat, a today threat to regional security in Asia. These competing claims have existed for many years. China asserts, for example, that it has indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters around it, as well as the seabed. In other words, everything inside that 9-dash line, that's China. China has never, the claim is based on this unspecified historic rights, which they say are in the 9-dash line. Once someone did a 10-dash line, and that's why there's a second set of dashes there, but 9-dash seems to have more, it seems to be more, it rolls off the tongue more easily, and perhaps it's even good for poetry. So we use 9-dash. The point is China has not told anyone what this actually means other than it's Chinese territory.
Bill, if you could just take just a couple of months.
In fact, I'm almost through.
Good.
This slide simply points out that there are 6 other states in the region that claims overlap China's claim, the most important of which are Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And they use something different. China uses historic rights, which don't really exist in law, as the basis of their claim. These countries used the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and ancillary international law factors to pursue their claims. What the story is, I would say, for all of us right now, is what China is doing that others are not doing, or at least not doing quite so well. Creating artificial islands around rocks or submerged features. The Chinese army constructing military facilities like this that sometimes they identify as search and rescue and navigation sites, but in fact are military facilities. And the Chinese have been battling the fishing ships and the naval and Coast Guard vessels of other states in the region to drive them away from places that China claims. Finally, they've stated emphatically that they will not abide by any arbitration decision, such as the one the Philippines is pursuing right now in The Hague. So the South China Sea is but one of many unresolved territorial claims in Asia. Across the region, there are reasons for conflict over territorial claims. The potential they have for becoming flashpoints increases because of a lack of regional institutions in Asia to solve disputes. There is no EU. There is no system for resolving these territorial claims or any other political disputes that might arise. Lastly, I was going to talk about what else could go wrong, and I will whip through this very quickly. The technical term is state collapse or crisis of geopolitical importance. It's what else could go wrong. We have a military coup in Thailand, which has taken Thailand away from its traditional alliance with the United States and nudged it more towards China. We have internal conflicts of various sorts based on ethnic differences, religious differences, or I just don't like you. The region, this ungoverned region of Southeast Asia, is a source of fighters for ISIS. Nobody knows how many, but we know what happened the last time that Muslim fighters from Southeast Asia and South Asia went to the Middle East to engage in conflicts. They produced these kinds of returns when they got home. So large-scale terrorist attacks as a consequence of ISIS fighters returning to the region is a reasonable expectation, but one not well known. And lastly, climate change is wreaking havoc in Southeast Asia in particular, and South Asia, but also in China as well. And the future of the region is in long-term problems. So getting back to where we are, I said we want to sustain these kinds of traditional goals in Asia. The stable, diversified regional security order. We want to create an open, transparent economic order and maintain a liberal political order. This is what we have been interested in the United States. The challenge for the 21st century, how to integrate China and possibly India into this system with a minimum of possible friction so that the United States can remain and thrive as an Asia-Pacific power. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bill. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to close out the session with a description of some work that I've been involved in. Thank you. Our Secretary of Defense is very concerned that as he looks at Putin's aggressiveness, assertiveness in Russia's west and southwest, that he has been taking the initiative, and he wants to get ahead and be ready, anticipate and be ready to checkmate any moves that Putin might make. He turned to his senior Europe NATO advisor and asked him to put together a team to analyze how we got to where we are and how we can take the initiative away from Putin. The advisor turned to me and asked me to put together a team of people at RAND to do just that. And I'm going to share large parts of that analysis with you right now. And the first thing I want to do is we sat down, we scratched our heads, and we said, okay, what are we up against? What is Putin up to anyway? And it's half a joke. It's half a joke. Okay, the strategic environment that we're presented with is that frontline NATO states are feeling vulnerable, and for good reason. Estonia and Latvia have sizable ethnic Russian populations in their west, as did Ukraine, and this is a favorable starting point for Putin if he wants to continue to nibble around at the edges of Russia and make Russia great again, reestablish Russia in what he regards as its appropriate role in the world. Poland and Romania, although they don't border continental Russia, there's an enclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea coast of Poland, but otherwise they don't border Russia. But they're nervous. Then there are non-NATO states that are partners, friendly, would like to be friendly to the West, in some cases would like to play us off against Moscow. Ukraine, by all means, continues to feel vulnerable. Moldova has a large ethnic Russian population as well, very nervous about what happened in Ukraine. Georgia, already a piece of its territory sliced off by Russian action. And this hasn't hit Kazakhstan yet, but Nazarbayev has a sizable Russian ethnic population in the north of Kazakhstan. And we at RAND had been working with the Department of Defense to engage Kazakhstan in planning, in strategy review and so forth. And we were getting a very cool response until Putin's actions in Ukraine. And then Kazakhstan very quickly began engaging with us, and we are engaging with Kazakhstan as well. I put this up just as a reminder. You all know the geography, but Central Europe, of course, has a couple of key challenges for NATO members, and that's the Baltic states in particular, and again, Estonia and Latvia. Russia is right up against the border of Estonia and Latvia. The closest place where there are sizable mobile NATO deployments is in Germany, and that's much farther away than Russia. So let's take a look. First of all, is it a question of defense spending? The answer is no. We spend about 580, $90 billion a year on defense. China, second, a little over 200,000 and growing. Russia has been struggling along at 120 billion approximately. And then there are NATO allies who spend a comparable amount to Russia. So it's not a matter of resources, it's much more a matter of how we plan and what we focus on. Now, what we in the U.S. Have largely mastered is the high-intensity, fast-paced combat operations. We're very good at that. There's no match in the world we could beat in a head-to-head war. We could beat any country with great confidence. But that's not the problem that is presenting itself to us. And what we did is we analyzed what direction warfare is going. First generation warfare was whoever had the greatest manpower, armed manpower, and this was when combat was face to face. You know, don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes. Napoleon figured out that he could have the levée en masse, the broad conscription, get a lot of young men into the service, and he didn't have to really train them. He just had to drill them a little bit. The Industrial Revolution meant that he could manufacture lots and lots and lots of rifles, and he did. So he dominated warfare in Europe for a generation, setting aside how bright it was of him to try to go to Moscow. That, of course, was his undoing. But then, in the next generation, we figured out, the West, or the Allies, figured out that it wasn't just how many men you could put in trenches across Europe, but you could use artillery to focus on key points of the enemy's battlefield. Not only that, by now you could load artillery shells from the back of the artillery piece. You didn't have to go out front with gunpowder and then putting a cannonball in, which was a very vulnerable position to be in. You could sneak up in the back and just toss the artillery shell in. So we, the Allies, won World War I because we figured out before the Germans that we could mass firepower on critical concentrations of enemy forces. Then we got a little complacent, and along came the Blitzkrieg in 1939. The Germans figured out that they could armor up vehicles, find a weak point in the enemy lines, punch through it, and then go into the back, into the rear areas and just raise mayhem and confusion among the enemy. And that worked very well until we got into the war and the Germans, over time, were exhausted. Now, as I said, this is a kind of warfare that we're very, very good in. We have a problem, though, and that is that there's a new kind of warfare that's emerged that we're struggling very badly with. And that is what we call fourth-generation warfare. This is typified by, and this is what we see in the Middle East. It's also what we see, what we have seen in Ukraine. And that is that the combatants are no longer state-supported and centrally controlled. The units that make up these forces tend to be small and dispersed. They don't have a clear hierarchy in command. It's more likely to be a network held together by, well, social media and other means of communication. Head-on engagement tends to be avoided. Guerrilla and terrorist tactics are the hallmark. And this is what we're seeing in eastern Syria, western Iraq, and pieces of southern Turkey. There are numerous bands. They don't answer to a single commander, and it's very hard to sort out the place for us to concentrate what we do in the war. We also saw this in Ukraine. Russia supported the ethnic Russian majority in eastern Ukraine. But what they did is not a front-on invasion. They put in their version of special operations forces. They worked with local militia gangs, supplied them with arms. I call them militia. That's two kind of term. You know, goons, thugs, hoodlums, gangs. But this is much different than a head-on invasion. So let's focus in on Estonia and Latvia, which became the focus of this study group. We have sizable ethnic minorities, which could, again, provide a welcoming environment for Russian operatives, and aggression in the Baltics that mirrors what Russia did in eastern Ukraine is presenting, or the idea, the possibility of it is presenting a very thorny problem to the NATO command. valuable time passes before a situation like happened in eastern Ukraine really clarifies and generates a response. The initial signals are often ambiguous, deliberately so, and a classic military response in the Balkans, Estonia and Latvia in particular, would require weeks for NATO to deploy forces, and that could be just too late, even if we were putting the correct forces in. I'm going to just give you this map now to focus a little more on the Baltics. Look how far Germany is, which would be our staging area, maybe Poland, to Latvia and Estonia. And of course, Russia is right up against the border. One could imagine military exercises by Russia just to the east of Estonia and Latvia, which could turn to support for ethnic Russians who were encouraged by Russian special operations forces. So we're at a distance, Russia is not, that's bad. We did some wargaming. The Department of Defense asked us to analyze what Russia would need, or what NATO would need to defend the Baltics, and again, Estonia and Latvia in particular. Here are key findings, and they're bad. They're very serious. Russian forces, from a standing start, could reach Tallinn or Riga in about 60 hours, and that's not very long. On the contrary, NATO would need a D-Day force of at least 7 brigades, somewhat more than 2 divisions if you think of military formations, to provide a credible deterrent. That's very hard to do. Would take us 30 days or more. Okay, another quote. What is to be done? And now I'm going to go through measures that we are recommending to the Secretary of Defense. Yes, speed deployment of NATO forces, and that's happening. Try to integrate capable partners, Sweden and Finland, and that's, if you look at the geography, look how much closer Finland is, and Sweden, mostly Finland, than Germany or Poland to these states. We can also, and our Secretary of Defense, very interested in technologies, looking at how we can leverage our strong advantage over Russia in technology to close this gap. Okay, we're throwing money at the problem, $3.4 billion dedicated specifically to pre-positioned military equipment in the region so we can get into the region more quickly, increase U.S. presence in the region, exercises, and what we think we could do is get 5 U.S., I actually should say U.S. and NATO, brigades into the front lines in about 30 days. Is that enough? Probably not. But it's a big improvement over what we can do now. Capable partner countries. This is a very important development. Sweden and Finland have spent decades making believe they're neutral. They're not. And Sweden first just broke the mold, and for the last 13 years, any Swedish military system, aircraft, communications, surveillance, have been developed to be interoperable with NATO standards, NATO forces. So Sweden is lining up. They are now physically ready to operate efficiently with NATO forces, and this, we hope and think, provides a portion of deterrence. More important, Finland, and this would be unthinkable just a year or two ago, Finland has invited the U.S. and other NATO allies, but especially the U.S., to participate in warfare exercises on their territory. What the Finnish leadership has decided is that, yeah, this may be poking Putin in the eye a bit, but it's much more dangerous to try to accommodate Putin and talk in a friendly, constructive manner with him. They have decided that Putin would interpret that as weakness, and that they're better off casting the lot explicitly with NATO, with the United States in particular. So, absolutely unthinkable just a couple of years ago, inviting the U.S. onto territory. I'm going to jump over this one as a matter of time, but Secretary of Defense Carter has asked us to look at some initiatives, cyber capability to disrupt Russian operations, hopefully as a deterrent, and then higher accuracy munitions and more of them to blunt any Soviet advance, and then little unmanned robot boats that can disrupt Russian operations in the Baltic and the Black Seas. Okay, there's some bad news for Russia. Russian economy has become dependent on the export of raw materials. Oil and gas exports generated 52% of federal revenues when oil sold at $110. Oil is now down to $40 to $50 a barrel. The ruble has depreciated 50% against the dollar, severely restraining Western input. The loss of federal revenue has led to a contraction of 3.7% in the Russian economy, and there's more coming. The result, a 10% drop in Russian defense spending, and even with this austerity, Russia will be drawing down its currency reserves, and further drop in defense spending is unavoidable. Good news, Bill, building off of what you said about what countries we are to worry about over the long term, easy money from energy exports has hampered the growth of value-added industries that we've seen in China and India. Fallout, the Russian defense sector is falling behind in incorporating the latest technologies. Okay, that's a quick tour de l'horizon of the globe, and in this case, what we're planning for a response to get ahead of the game and be ready to respond to Mr. Putin. Please.